You are listening to Book Clips, a mini podcast in which authors or narrators do readings from novels. Check out the show notes for the synopsis and buy links for this book.
Chapter 1. The dawn light didn't wake Tasia from slumber. The birds did. She was accustomed to the morning song of the birds. In childhood, they woke her nearly every morning with their musical chittering, their high voices like crystal chimes blowing in a gentle wind. Birdsong was followed by the matching chatter of her mother, cooing to them as they cooed to her, while she sprinkled their breakfast of seeds and grains across the red brick of the inner courtyard. Tasia, not quite 5 yet, would go to the window, stand on tiptoes on her trunk in order to peer through the muslin drapes and into the courtyard below. Even then, her mother had seemed more angel than human, her long blue sleeping gown hiding her feet so that she didn't walk across the courtyard so much as she glided, her little white birds with their bright yellow tails following along behind her, singing out their morning joy, waking the royal family one by one. But the palace birds imported from her mother's northeastern homeland were not the birds that woke Tasia now. There was nothing magical or musical or joyful about this birdsong. It was the rough caw, caw of city crows that roused her from sleep, that reminded her she wasn't at home. She woke from the dream of her mother with a shallow gasp, disoriented, eyes wide and searching for light in the dark, stuffy room. She stifled an annoyed groan when she realized where she was, disentangling herself from the heavy bare arm and heavy bare leg draped over her. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. What time was it? She stood from the bed, nearly tripping on a sheet that had wound itself around her ankle like a constricting snake, then began groping blindly for her discarded clothes. Moonlight filtered in through the high open window, which meant she had somehow managed to wake herself before dawn. Well, the city crows had woken her, actually. Gods be thanked for those damnable birds, she thought, shaking an undergarment loose from another tangled sheet. She pulled it on hastily, even as the man in bed grunted and seemed to half-wake. Where had she dropped that ugly brown shift she'd had her handmaid borrow from the cook's daughter? "Tasia?" said the man in the bed groggily. He lifted himself on one elbow, combing long brown hair from his face with his other hand. "Are you leaving?" "It's the middle of the night, Marcus," Tasia said. "Close to dawn, really. The crows woke me." Marcus's brown eyes grew large. "Did we fall asleep?" Tasia almost snapped. "Of course we did, you idiot," but managed to contain her irritation. It wasn't his fault she had fallen asleep. He always fell asleep after sex. That was the time when she generally dressed and slipped out, just as the city guard called out 11 of the clock. But last night he had begged her to stay with him a while longer, and Tasia, with her thoughts drifting to other topics, other worries, other lovers, had foolishly allowed herself to fall into the welcome oblivion of unconsciousness. "Yes," Tasia said, pulling on the shift she'd finally found. "We fell asleep." Marcus sat up, sheets falling away from his bare chest. With moonlight glinting off the well-defined planes of his body, Tasia momentarily remembered why she still found herself in his apartments once or twice per week. "There's no point in you leaving now," he said. "If it's almost dawn, the card merchants will be setting up outside anyway. They'll see you. You should stay." Tasia shook her head. "It's not that close to dawn. The moon is still out. I have time." He reached for her wrist, but she took a quick step backwards. "Stay," Marcus implored. "No," she said curtly. "We've talked about this before. It is risky enough for me to be doing this as it is. You know what would happen if my father found us out." "I'm not afraid of your father," Marcus said, but his eyes gave him away. She let out a half-laugh, not bothering to humor him with a response. "Until we meet again," she said, bending forward to kiss his brow. She slipped her shoes on, pulling the navy blue cloak with the heavy hood around herself, and picked up the basket of bread she'd left next to the door, her usual prop for these visits. Anyone on the street who saw a hunched and hooded girl with a basket of bread would just assume she was a baker's girl, finishing a late-night delivery to the Ambassador Quarter. Late-night delivery, maybe, but pre-dawn delivery? No one with respectable business would be leaving the quarter at this hour. Tasia continued to chastise herself as she hastened down the back stairs from Marcus's apartments, fabricating an excuse in her head in case she had the misfortune to arrive at the palace during the changing of the guard. Which was why she didn't see the shadow slip onto the street a few paces behind her as she hurried up the hill that paralleled the Royal Canal. She had an arrangement with the guardsmen of Sunfall Gate, the palace gate most commoners referred to as Westgate. 2 silver pennies for each man on guard when she quietly slipped away. 1 penny on her way out, the 2nd penny on her way back in. She'd bought their silence, it was true, and as her father was wont to say, "Loyalty paid for is no loyalty at all," which was why she'd also taken care to learn each of their names, their wives' names, their children's names. On the nights when she had the time for it, she traded bawdy jokes with them, shared the leftover pastries from her baker's girl's basket. The night guardsmen of Westgate were her friends, inasmuch as a princess can make friends with common soldiers. But the morning guard? That was a different story. The night belonged to Tasia. The morning belonged to her father, the Emperor. No quantity of pennies or dirty jokes would stop the morning guard from turning her in. And so she walked as fast as she could, without running, panting, and perspiring up the hill, determined to make the gate before the guard changed. Later it would almost amuse her that her most pressing concern that night was not getting caught by the morning guard. Tasia was so focused on making the hill's crest that the first touch of the hand behind her did nothing to dilute her focus. It wasn't until the same hand tightened around the arm that held her breadbasket that Tasia noticed it at all. The man acted too quickly for the princess to call for help. In one swift sweep of his arm, he swung her towards him with such force that Tasia lost her balance, feet tangling together beneath her. On instinct, she opened her mouth to scream, but he slapped his other hand against her mouth. "I will make it hurt more if you scream," he hissed, yellowed teeth mere inches from Tasia's face. He was taller than her, but not by much, with black hair cut in a severe ring around his head, shaved to his scalp below the black fringe. He wore heavy robes, gray and plain, and cinched at his waist with a white rope. "He's a wise man," Tasia thought, with a shock of incredulity. But that made no sense. She knew every wise man in the city, and she'd never seen this man's face before. He pulled an iron knife from somewhere within his robes, its blade as black as his hair. Not just any wise man. A wise man who intended to kill her. Something about the realization brought the world into focus for her. Regaining her balance, Tasia struck out with one foot, hard and low against his shin. The first kick in a fight should always be low. She'd learned that from the night guardsmen's bragging, boisterous tales of their barroom brawls and misadventures. The wise man's grip on her arm loosened. Not much, but just enough for Tasia to take a half-step backwards. She drove her knee upward, hard and swift. She'd aimed for his groin, but missed somehow, and felt her knee crack against the bottom of his rib cage. It was good enough. He grunted and let go. Tasia sprinted up the hill, knowing if she could just outpace him by 100 yards, she'd be able to call out for help, and her friends of the Westgate Guard would recognize her voice in the night. But she could not outpace him. He was on her again in an instant, before she'd managed to evade him by so much as a yard. This time he grabbed the back of the cloak, yanking hard so that the leather tie in the front dug into her throat. "You're only making it harder on yourself, Princess," he said as she stumbled backward into him. He threw her roughly to the ground, her chin smacking against the cobblestones before the rest of her. He planted a knee in her back, pinning her. He leaned closer to roll Tasia over, but she was ready for him, grabbing the wrist that held the knife, trying to wrest it from his hand. "No!" she screamed at him, unable to find any other words. "No, no, no!" The wise man tried to extract his wrist, but she had the wrist with both hands now, refusing to let go. He used his free hand to slap her hard against the face, once, then twice. "No!" Tasia yelled again, still stubborn and fighting despite the pain blossoming in her chin, her cheeks, the scraped palms and bruised knees where she'd hit the pavement. But he was far stronger than she, far heavier, and she knew she would lose this battle. And that was the worst part about it, knowing that she would lose before the end actually came. Chapter 2. He pulled his wrist loose at last, and the knife arced up, its black blade refusing to reflect the moonlight. Tasia closed her eyes on instinct, body tightening in anticipation of the final blow. But then there was a series of shouts, a muffled cry, and the weight pressing her into the cobblestones mercifully disappeared. Tasia opened her eyes in time to see two men in city guard uniforms sling the wise man face first into the middle of the street. One guard yelled obscenities, his short sword's blade pressed to the wise man's throat. The other guard busied himself tying the would-be assassin's hands behind his back with a length of twine. Dazed, Tasia made her way to her knees, gathering the scattered contents of her breadbasket from the pavement. On instinct, she picked up the wise man's black iron knife as well, dropping it into the basket with the bread. Fortunately, the ring with the Royal Crest of the House of Dorsa was still in its hiding place inside a loaf of bread. She pulled it out hastily and put it on her finger, rotating it so that the crest faced down instead of up. She would only reveal her identity if she had to. One of the guards looked over at her. "Girl, you all right?" "Yes, thank you." She tugged her hood down a little lower, avoided his gaze, and went back to gathering her fallen bread. But she could feel the guard's eyes on her. "Awfully late for a bread delivery," he said with obvious skepticism. He took a few steps closer to her. Tasia decided the best course of action was to not respond. That was what a humble, lowly baker's girl would do if approached by the city guard, wasn't it? So she only nodded and brushed dirt from a loaf. "Where are you going?" asked the guard. Through the shadows cast by her cloak's hood, she glanced at the guard, then her attacker. The wise man on the ground appeared to be unconscious now. A starburst of blood painted his temple red and trickled down his cheek. Like it or not, Tasia had the full attention of both guards. One of them was huge, with wiry black hair and a black beard that protruded out from beneath his leather cap and spilled halfway down his chest like a plant that had overgrown its pot. The other, the one who'd suggested it was too late for a bread delivery, was average-sized, but looked puny next to the big man. He wore no leather cap, and he wore his oiled hair slicked back behind his ears. Both guards inspected her with open curiosity. It was indeed the wrong time and the wrong place to find a baker's girl alone on the street. "I'm going home," Tasia replied. She made her voice soft, timid, the way a baker's girl's would be. She looked away from the guards, keeping her face hidden within the hood. "We'll escort you," said the guard with the slicked back hair. "No." Tasia said it too firmly, too quickly, realizing as soon as the word escaped her lips that a baker's girl wouldn't speak in such a contrarian tone to a member of the city guard, especially not a frightened baker's girl who'd just been attacked. She tried to correct herself, but instead made a second blunder. "I'm close to home. I know the way." The big guard with the wild black hair stood up, straddling the fallen wise man. He was even bigger on his feet, looming over the unconscious man. "Close to home," said the bear-sized man. "You're in the ambassador quarter." The shorter guard took another step closer. He cocked his head like a cat, narrowing his eyes at Tasia. "Feign confusion," instinct told Tasia. She straightened, turned her gaze away from the guards, rubbed the tender spot on the back of her head with imagined absent-mindedness as she rotated in a slow circle. Behind her, dark water gently lapped at the bank of the Royal Canal. "But isn't that the canal?" she asked. "It is." She paused. "The merchant canal?" "No," said the big guard. "The Royal Canal." She spun on her heel back towards the guards. "The Royal Canal? How? Where am I? Did you say this was the ambassador quarter?" The guards exchanged a glance, and the one with the slicked-back hair chuckled. "I think you must have hit your head harder than you thought, girl. You'd better let us walk you home." Tasia didn't respond. "But wait, Mac," said the big-bearded one. "How are we gonna walk her home, eh? What are we gonna do with him?" He towed the body of the unconscious wise man. The slick-haired guard, Mac, considered this for a second. "Take him to the guard station and wait for the shift change. You can handle him on your own as long as he's tied up, can't you? I can walk her home." The big guard grinned. "Sure, Mac. You get the girl to yourself. I get stuck with the murderous wise man." "Just take him. I'll be back soon enough." The big guard grumbled, but he bent down anyway, hefting the wise man and slinging him over one huge shoulder, like an overlarge sack of potatoes. "You're only making me carry him because you don't have the strength to do it yourself," the guard told Mac.
You have been listening to Book Clips. Check out the show notes for the synopsis and buy links for this book. If you are interested in showcasing your novel, then check out the show notes for more information.